All right, so I'm Caspar van Lissa. I'm an associate professor of social data science at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And one of my research areas is machine learning informed research synthesis. And today, specifically, I will talk about text mining systematic review methods. So I'm not one of these machine learning optimists who think that, every problem is a nail and all we've got is this hammer, which is machine learning. But I do think machine learning can solve some unique challenges in research synthesis, and that's where my focus is. So last time I was in this speaker series, I talked about how we can use machine learning to deal with a problem that most applied meta-analyses have so many between study differences that could be coded as moderators, that it becomes hard to see the forest from the trees. And I talked about two algorithms that I've developed, namely metaforest and penalized meta-regression. And both of these set to do the task of reducing the number of moderators and identifying relevant ones. I'm not talking about that today. Today, I'm talking about a different problem, which is that there are too many papers to read. The literature in most fields is exponentially increasing, and it is just impossible for us to keep up with all the reading. So we're going to, at some point, need to recruit the assistance of machine learning tools to make the literature more accessible. But there are related problems that I think machine learning is well equipped to address. One example is the so-called jingle jangle fallacy. Even if you and I are interested in exactly the same research question, we might use a slightly different vernacular to describe the problem. And that can be difficult for humans to assess. So we might end up in a kind of cul-de-sac of our own literature, subliterature, where we all use these terms and not be as aware of a different cul-de-sac that studies similar problems, but with different terms. But computers are quite good at identifying that these different terms mean the same thing. And another reason why using machine learning tools to make the literature accessible is useful is because many papers look at specific pieces of the puzzle, just the links between a few variables, and that makes it hard to see the big picture. And as I will explain, the specific tools of text mining can help us zoom out and bring the full picture into view. So the techniques that I've worked on, I call text mining systematic review. And let me define that term first. So text mining systematic review is an umbrella term that refers to any machine learning informed qualitative research synthesis methods. You could also say quantitatively aided qualitative research synthesis. So the idea here is to get a sense of what people are writing about in a field of the literature. So the unit of analysis is the comprehensive body of literature in a subfield of the literature. The output tends to be a simplified or structured map of that literature. And the methods that are used from the machine learning stable are text mining and natural language processing tools. What does this give us? Well, here are some example research questions that TMSR allows us to answer. For example, what are people in my field writing about? Where exactly is my work positioned in relation to that of others? What are the most common or central constructs that people discuss? Which of them are often studied conjointly? And what are potential covariates or control variables that I might want to include when I design a new study in this area? And how does this bottom-up data-driven map of the literature compare to existing top-down representations of the field, for example, as have been constructed by narrative reviews? It can also help identify areas for future research if we find terms that are kind of on the fringes of the map, and it can also help identify which constructs are over or underrepresented in the map. I will show visual examples of this later. So the general steps of a text mining systematic review are as follows. First, you conduct a systematic search, and I always cite my former colleague Janneke Staaks, who assembled this really great resource for how to conduct a systematic search. She was a librarian. And then you have to screen articles to select relevant ones. In this stage, it's also possible to use machine learning informed tools. I like to cite AS Review, which is a free open source tool for in and excluding studies by using reinforcement learning to train a machine learning model which kind of studies you are interested in and help using that to help you select them. It's not absolutely essential to only include the relevant studies. So in most analyses, we accept that there will be some noise. And if we include a few irrelevant or less relevant studies in a text mining systematic review, that will introduce some noise, but it might not be too problematic. The third step is pre-processing. So if you have free text that you're analyzing, you want to remove CRUD. So some words might be ill-formed due to the conversion from PDF, for example. There may be markup code that ends up in there, which we don't need. There may be numbers, formulas, etc. So we exclude CRUD. And one step that I always do is to identify compound nouns, because nouns are the things that people write about. So my goal is always to create kind of a nomological network of the topics that people study in a literature, and for this we need the compound nouns. But because of the aforementioned jingle-jangle fallacy, which is that people might use different nouns to describe the same theoretical construct, we need to cluster the literal words they use so that words with a similar meaning are put together into a cluster. And once we have these clusters, we can visualize the data as a co-occurrence matrix, which tells us how often two constructs occur together within the same paper or even within the same sentence. And this tells us something about a connection between the two. And we can visualize such a matrix as a co-occurrence graph, or we can just visualize the construct and the co-occurrence frequency. We can analyze different graph properties like which of the constructs are most central in the graph, etc. How does this compare to other research synthesis methods? So here's a table, and at the top is meta-analysis, which is arguably the most common research synthesis technique. This is a top-down or deductive technique, which is to say you start with a very specific and narrow research question. It's also quantitative, so you're estimating a pooled estimate for the effect size, which is numeric. So you also need those quantities from all of the papers that are included. And it's often of medium scope. So most meta-analyses, I think, have, I think the statistic is around 10 papers included, but of course we know examples that have hundreds of papers included, and some examples with just a few studies. Now, if we compare that to text mining systematic review, that is not top-down, it's fully bottom-up. We're trying to make sense of all of the unstructured text in the papers that we've selected. It is somewhat quantitative because we find different ways to convert free text into numeric representations. I will get into that in a second. And it has a very large scope. So theoretically, through automation, it is possible to include as many papers as you want. So tens of thousands, no problem. And there are also other methods that relate to this. For example, narrative synthesis, that is also top-down because we are structured by specific research questions and by our prior understanding of how the field is put together, is not often quantitative. So typically people just read the papers and structure the knowledge that they extract subjectively. And the scope tends to be small. So narrative reviews, they tend to be structured around pre-existing ideas, and people don't have the capacity to read tens of thousands of papers. So as I mentioned before, narrative reviews have some shortcomings. They tend to have small samples. They are subject to confirmation bias because the human agent is the person who performs the synthesis. And they tend to overemphasize positive results because people are more attuned to the presence of effects than their absence. And this is all taken from a great paper by Julia Littell. Text mining systematic review is also somewhat close to the practice of science mapping, with the key difference that science mapping is often based on literal keyword searches and manual curation of those terms. I think I will get back to this in a second, so I'll skip this for now. So I will give you a few examples of the work that we have done with text mining systematic review to date. And the first application was a paper in which I synthesized the literature on emotion regulation in adolescents. The reason we did this is because emotion regulation adolescence is a developmentally sensitive period for emotion regulation, and as many as 1 in 5 teenagers develop emotion relation regulated psychopathology. And meanwhile, in my country of the Netherlands, this is up to 30%, which is a doubling in the Netherlands in the past 5 years. So this is a really important issue, and 20% of our healthcare costs are directly attributable to this issue. And for the teens, the consequences can be dire and they can have lifelong implications for mental health and well-being. So that's why we care about this problem. But there is a substantial knowledge gap because even though there is much empirical research about emotion regulation in teens, different subdisciplines have approached the topic in very different ways. So we get the jingle jangle fallacy. They don't use consistent terminology. There are no conceptual frameworks guiding measurement, and there is no overarching theoretical framework guiding the research. In other words, here is a key challenge for bottom-up synthesis of the work that has been done in order to formalize that into a more theoretical framework. So the limitations of existing theories is that they either don't address adolescence or they don't address emotion regulation in sufficient detail. None of them are really used to guide contemporary research, and they vary in scope. Some are very broad, but non-specific, and others are very specific, but too limited in scope. So why am I bringing up theory in relation to text mining systematic review? Well, because according to theory construction methods, identifying relevant phenomena is the first step towards constructing theory. And this is often done by either putting a panel of experts in a room or by narratively reviewing the existing literature. But I would argue that text mining systematic review is a great alternative way to create a sort of rudimentary nomological network of the relevant phenomena pertaining to this specific topic. So that's what I did. I developed very rudimentary text mining systematic review methods, which have the benefit that they can be applied to a very large sample of papers. And I curated a sample of about 6,500 papers on emotion regulation in adolescence. Here's a link to the paper that I wrote about this. And all of the code and data are available on a reproducible repository. So if you want to apply these methods to your own work, you can just copy the whole folder, replace the data, tune up the methods if you like, and rerun the analysis. So for this paper, the first thing that I did was curate a baseline network of the constructs that had already been discussed in previous theories or narrative reviews. So here's a list of all of the theories that I identified. And that network looks like the one on the left. So this is a very simple network because I constructed it by hand. And we see emotion regulation is in the center because I only selected theories that pertain to emotion regulation. And then we see, for example, that parents are thought to be a cause, but also polyvagal activation. So that's a neuroscience concept. The endocrine system, attachment to the parents. So that's more of a developmental psychological term. Socioeconomic status, more of a sociological term. So you see that all these different factors are represented there. And then the network on the right is based on prior narrative reviews. And what you see is that some of the terms were already present in theories like parenting, but some terms were present in the narrative reviews and not in theory, such as device use over here. Now, a very good reason for that is that most of the theories hail back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when device use just wasn't an issue. So we can learn something by enhancing what was previously discussed in theory with new insights from narrative reviews. And then my text mining systematic review goes even further and enhances that network with data-driven insights. So here's the basic pipeline. We start with a corpus or a body of all of the literature. Then we select the nouns and adjectives. And for this paper, I used a simple dictionary-based clustering. So I used my own expertise in the domain to create a dictionary and enhance that over time. And that's how we grouped terms. So for example, emotion regulation relates to emotion, affect, anger, plus regulation or problem or adjustment or competence. And here for sex, for example, I look for boys, girls, male, female, gender, etc. So the pipeline goes like this, and I moderate the dictionary-based clustering step of the pipeline. And then this graph shows us how frequently certain constructs emerged. And these graphs tend to follow sort of an exponential curve. So it's a bit hard to see, but emotion regulation, of course, is most common, followed by mental health, depression, externalizing problems, etc. And then here's a network representation of the graph. So if we compare that to the manually curated network, we see slightly more complexity, but we also see a lot of replication. So of course, emotion regulation is a central construct, but so is emotion, and so is depression, anxiety, and mental health. So those are perhaps associated with emotion regulation. And we see that some of the terms that were discussed in theory are also present, like polyvagal, attachment, family functioning. And we again see that also the text mining systematic review identifies device use as relevant for emotion regulation, but also minority status was not discussed in theory before. Sex, and I think that there's also sexual development. So that was also not covered in theory, perhaps because in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it was a bit sensitive to write about teenagers and sexual activity. So the results are that these data-driven analyses do pick up on constructs that are also discussed in theory, and mental health-related outcomes feature prominently. There's substantial correspondence between analysis of keywords and of abstracts. I didn't get into detail on that, but this suggests that the method is valid if it picks up similar patterns when analyzing different types of data. And it confirms that the networks are somewhat sparse. So this problem that was previously identified, that this literature is somewhat fragmented, is also visually evident when we look at the networks extracted from this literature. So most terms are directly connected to emotion regulation, but not to each other. We also identified some under-theorized terms, mostly pertaining to developmental disorders, physical health, external stressors, structural disadvantage, addictive behavior, identity and moral development, and sexual development. So this helps us because this tells us what constructs are relevant in the field, but not represented in theory. So text mining systematic review can offer guidance for phenomena to consider as relevant constructs in theory development or as co-founders or causes. And unembedded terms, so things that are not connected to many other things, might indicate promising areas for future research. But there's a limitation here too. So this approach used a manually curated dictionary, which is still somewhat effortful, took about a week to curate that dictionary. And you need domain knowledge. It's not infinitely scalable, and it doesn't account for the meaning of words in context. So in the second example, we tried to remedy some of those limitations. And for this study, we analyzed the so-called Cooperation Data Bank by Dan Balliot. This is a great sandbox for developing new research synthesis methods because they comprehensively curated all experimental research on cooperation in prisoners' dilemmas. And we wanted to see what constructs were connected to cooperation in prisoners' dilemmas. So cooperation is a way to resolve social dilemmas at some personal cost. Such dilemmas occur in all diets, groups, organizations, and societies. And there's a lot of research on this from different fields. So again, we have the fragmented literature problem. The Cooperation Data Bank is a comprehensive archive of over 2,000 papers. And they manually coded metadata, effect sizes, and moderators. So this is a multi-million-dollar data collection project. It has already been sliced and diced every which way using cutting-edge meta-analysis and bibliometric approaches. But what had not been done yet is a qualitative analysis. So that's what we did. We performed the first qualitative research synthesis of the Cooperation Data Bank, and one of the first qualitative syntheses of cooperation literature in general. And we automated clustering to a greater extent than in the previous example that I gave, and we also accounted for word meaning to a greater extent. And I will tell you how we did that. So the pipeline for this study was slightly more sophisticated. Again, we started with the full corpus. we selected nouns and adjectives, but then we used transformer models to convert words to numbers. So each word is placed in a vast numeric space, and words with similar meaning end up closer together in that space. And where words are placed in space also depends on how they are used in context. So the exact same word can be placed in a different location depending on how the author used that word. So after we do this, we have a space with over 700 dimensions, which is difficult to analyze. So we reduced the dimensionality to, I believe, 30. And then we just drew circles around words that are grouped closely together to identify theoretically relevant constructs. So that's a clustering approach. All of this is quantitative. So there is less researcher moderation of the pipeline in this case. And this is the resulting network. So what we see is that, as expected, cooperation is very central, closely connected to incentives for cooperation, the presence or absence of a group. So you can think of in-group versus out-group cooperation, the different strategies that people use, the type of dilemma that they were involved in, like a prisoner's dilemma or public goods dilemma, resource dilemma, punishment, which can also be seen as a type of incentive, etc. So my co-authors who are experts in this field reflected on this graph, and they found that it made a lot of sense. So again, this suggests that the method does validly pick up on important constructs in a field. So we did some further analyses. We looked at which connections were the strongest. And again, we saw this kind of exponential curve. So some are very strong and then it tapers off. Won't get too much into that. But importantly, text mining systematic review painted a recognizable picture of the literature, which indeed focuses on cooperation, competition, altruism, harvesting, etc. Cooperation in groups and incentive structures were important moderators. Less attention was paid to resource dilemmas despite pressing societal problems. So this is an under-researched area. There are some important resource dilemmas like climate change, resource use, conservation, environmental protection. But at present, relatively little experimental research is addressing those. So there might be an area for growth. We also saw that demographics were important, specifically gender and age. But interestingly, meta-analyses on the effect of gender and age show that their effects are negligible. So this might be a human bias to focus on differences between people, but they're actually not empirically important. The same goes for culture. There's a lot of discussion about the role of culture in cooperation, but we've done a previous study investigating exactly that question with meta-analysis and found little evidence for cultural differences in cooperation. So again, this might reflect kind of a bias in our interests, but not a true substantial effect. So if you want to dig into the cooperation data bank further, it has an online interface that allows you to perform meta-analyses, and we hope to enhance that in the future with this kind of quantitatively aided qualitative analysis as well. We also looked whether there was a correlation between how prominently two constructs were connected and how strongly their meta-analytic effect size was. And we did find a moderate correlation between how often two things are researched together and how strong their meta-analytic association is. So to some extent, being connected in this network does tell us something about the strength of the association. But there are still limitations to this approach. Text mining systematic review does not yet capture the nature of relationships between co-occurring terms. So we know that people write about two constructs conjointly, but we don't know whether they think that there is a causal effect or a positive or a negative effect. We still don't know. Also, we analyzed abstracts for this analysis, and I think that's justifiable because abstracts are very focused, and an author puts everything they think is really important into the abstract, whereas the full text paper tends to be more noisy because there's more filler words. It also discusses things that are not directly related to the analysis of the paper itself, but you could additionally analyze full text papers. And one reason for that is simply computational load. So crunching these numbers takes about 24 hours. And if we did full text papers, that would be maybe 1 or 2 weeks. And the final example that I wanted to introduce is a little bit of work that we've done to capture the nature of associations between terms that are jointly discussed. So this is work on capturing causal claims in published papers by my PhD student, Rasul Norouzi. So why do we care about causality? Well, causality is a hallmark of strong theories with adequate empirical content. It's also a necessary assumption for interventions. So anytime that we expect the outcome to change when we give people a higher dose of the predictor, we are assuming causality. So we should care about the assumptions that authors make about causality. It's also important when substantiating scientific hypotheses, and if authors are ambiguous about their causal assumptions, it becomes harder to do scientific research because they might overinterpret a correlational finding as causational, or the opposite. They might believe that a finding is causal, but downplay it because they didn't conduct an experiment. So so this has been called strategic ambiguity, namely that causality is often not explicitly discussed. And this is especially a problem in social science, but I'm sure that in different intervention studies that are not experimental, people also make causal assumptions and they might not always be forthcoming about it. So as I mentioned before, text mining systematic review extracts a kind of nomological net, but it doesn't yet give us information about the nature of connections in that network. If we develop knowledge extraction methods like causal sentence detection, then those can complement text mining systematic review. So for this paper, we sought to identify causal claims, but it would be possible to train a model to extract other properties like the direction of the effect, positive or negative, or the functional form, direct, indirect, moderational, nonlinear, etc. So previous approaches to detect causal claims have either used rules. So for example, if people use the word cause, then this is a causal claim. Or they have used statistical machine learning methods, which require a lot of manual feature engineering and automated model building. Or they have used deep learning methods. And the advantage of deep learning methods is that it automates feature engineering and model building. But there's a key challenge, which is that if a model is trained in one domain, it does not necessarily perform well in other domains as well. So there are causal sentence detections models, but they've been typically trained on newspaper data, Twitter data, etc., but not yet on the scientific literature in a specific field. And that's what we did. So we had a factorial research design where we compared 4 different large language models, all of them open source. And we used 3 different types of training data. We either used only a general purpose data set, which came from newspapers and Twitter, etc., or a manually curated social science data set, or the combination of both. And then we tested those models' performance on either the general purpose data set or the social science data set. And our research questions were, how does the performance of these models vary when extracting causal sentences from social science literature? Is there evidence for domain shift bias so that those trained on general purpose data might perform worse on social science data? And does fine-tuning on the social science data increase performance? So we had general purpose data with about 10,000 causal and 3,000 non-causal sentences. And we manually curated social science data with about 500 causal and 500 non-causal sentences. And we had an inter-rater agreement of 0.76. So here are some examples. So these are causal sentences, right? So in North Korea, heavy rains caused widespread flooding. That's a causal sentence. And then compare that with one of our social science sentences. The presence of such a leader tends to increase coordination. So increase used as an active verb there signals causality. So we did find evidence of a domain shift bias from models trained on general purpose data. Fine-tuning on social science data did convey a performance advantage. For most, but not for all models, that came at a cost of decreased performance on the general data. So the model becomes more specialized in the specific subfield you fine-tune it for. But there was also no single best model. For all of the models, we saw that there was a balance between type 1 and type 2 error. So you have to choose which model you prefer based on whether false positives or false negatives are more problematic. We saw that the fine-tuned BERT model was best for detecting causal sentences, and the fine-tuned SciBERT model, which is trained on scientific papers, was best for detecting non-causal sentences. But it was not the case that the most complex models performed the best. So I want to emphasize this. I'm not necessarily a scale optimist. You can't assume that the most complex, most expensive models are always best. A smaller, fit-for-purpose model is often better. So I think this is an important first step for future research synthesis endeavors. And I encourage others interested in this area to curate more benchmark data sets from different domains of research, including intervention research. And if we combine this with text mining systematic review, which of course is one future direction we're taking this, then we could go further than creating a nomological net. We could construct a directed causal graph that can be used to perform causal inference in future non-experimental research. So I see that we have a few minutes left, and I just quickly want to go over some general principles for the use of text mining in research synthesis. And one of those principles is inductive bias. All the work I've discussed now differs greatly from meta-analysis because these are inductive techniques. They are bottom-up, data-driven, not top-down research question-driven. And that means that there are some inductive steps where the analysis is molded to fit the data. So if those decisions are implicit, if I'm just browsing through the data and think, oh, if I analyze it this way, it looks good to me, then the inductive bias is intractable. And you as a reader don't know how strongly it influenced the outcomes. But if I work in a fully reproducible manner, then those inductive steps become explicit, which makes the inductive bias tractable. You can perform a multiverse analysis where you look at how much the results vary if you follow my inductive decisions or if you make your own different decisions. And all of the studies that I've mentioned use the workflow for open reproducible code in science, or WORKS, which makes the analysis fully reproducible, and therefore it's possible to make the inductive bias tractable. So reproducible code allows us to quantify and study the effect of inductive bias. And if you combine reproducibility with automation, then you obtain scalability, which makes these very large text corpora accessible, and therefore addressing the problem of the infinitely growing literature. So these are key differences between, for example, text mining systematic review and systematic mapping. It's reproducible, it's largely automated. So if you do a subjective inductive analysis, like a narrative review, then you have data going in, you perform the analysis inside your head, so that's kind of a black box, and insight rolls out. But the approach that I'm advocating is where you are just moderating the building of a pipeline. So the data goes into the pipeline and it's crunched according to a transparent procedure that yields some insight, and you are the mechanic operating on the pipeline. Another key principle for the use of text mining in research synthesis is transparency. Let's compare the approaches I've advocated to ChatGPT. It is a black box. Moreover, we don't just not know what's in the box. What's in the box is subject to change at any time and without notification. There's also a conflict of interest. The company that owns an algorithm like GPT benefits from keeping it proprietary, regardless of whether it performs better or worse than open source alternatives. And it benefits from the impression of validity, but not necessarily from validating it. So I don't think it's up to us, incumbent on us as scientists, to go out there and validate that tools like ChatGPT are valid for research. I think it's incumbent upon us to build fit for purpose tools that can be used by anyone for scientific purposes. Moreover, if you use black box algorithms with human data, that becomes incompatible with the principles of ethical AI. Because any decisions made about humans, like therapeutic decisions, need to be tractable. It needs to be clear why an algorithm advocates one intervention over another. Moreover, scientific applications require strict control, which is just not there for these commercial solutions. We need to be able to control the model architecture so that we know what its affordances are. We need to know what diet of training data we fed the model, so what it could have learned. We need to know how the data is handled to be compliant with GDPR and privacy concerns, and we need to control the pre and post processing. So as I explained before, I'm also not a scale optimist, as evidenced by our third study that I presented. Complex models are not always better. The most complex model here, Llama, performed very poorly. And this is in part because complex models tend to overfit the data and therefore generalize poorly. Moreover, complex models are less sustainable. There's a large environmental cost to querying complex models, which also makes them costly and thereby drives access inequality and monopolies. So as scientists, we might want to build smaller fit-for-purpose models. To conclude, due to the exponentially increasing literature, I believe that work like text mining systematic review is a necessary direction of research to make all that literature accessible. But our focus as scholars should be on fit-for-purpose machine learning assisted methods that are transparent, reproducible, well-validated, and fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I think that the academic contribution of studies that only set out to validate proprietary commercial solutions is limited because it lacks transparency and control, and it's not academics' job to validate commercial products. That's my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful talk, actually. So I just before I start taking questions, I actually something kind of occurred to me. So I love, the last few slides on reproducible code, basically, and how, those could be kind of a measure of, how to actually look at bias in qualitative research. Because if you had these like very reproducible code, reproducible methods using automation, like you mentioned, um, those could be kind of hallmarks of, the best way to do kind of qualitative, research that is kind of more on the kind of more objective scale. However, a lot of qualitative research that I've done myself as well, is iterative. So, one of my PhD projects was very much qualitative, where we had to kind of do a large categorization. And as we went through, we learned about the research that we were doing. We learned more and more and more. And, within like 6 months, we had a better understanding to when we started. And then we ended up, actually recoding a lot of the research. And so I was wondering how you would integrate that kind of iterative model into this kind of system.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Carol. Yeah, that's a really great point. And one of the aspects of the way that I work with the workflow for open reproducible code in science is that this uses version control to track the entire origin of the project. So it has the full timeline. So especially when you are working iteratively, you can see the different kind of decision points in time and how they change the trajectory of the project. And you could even make those decision points parallel and look at how differently the results would have been if you hadn't tweaked your approach to coding at some point. So actually, this is fully congruent with the approach that I'm advocating. Yeah, so we use specifically the Git system for version control, which tracks the whole project timeline. And you can go back in time and you can compare different time points and the effect that they would have had on the outcomes of your analyses.
Yeah, sounds great. Actually, I'd love to see a paper just on that, on reproducibility and transparency in qualitative research. I mean, there's not that many papers about that out there. Maybe I'm wrong. Is there a literature about that?
Yeah, so this is my other research area is open science and reproducibility. I published the works paper with a small consortium. So this is a first principles approach to reproducibility in science. So we asked the question, what conditions must be met for scientific digital object to be fully reproducible? And then we give an applied implementation of that in an R package, but the principles also apply if you're working in a different environment like Python. And then my friend and colleague Aaron Peikert, who is also a climber and head of department at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, he wrote a very interesting mathematical proof, I guess, for why reproducibility makes inductive bias tractable. And I think it's just one of the most brilliant papers I've read in recent years. So I really recommend Aaron Peikert's work as well.
Okay, so I'll turn over to Guillaume, who asks, so thanks very much. How do you define the space coordinates of each word and its variation depending on context?
Yeah, so this is something that's out of our hands. So we're using these pre-trained large language models for that. So one that we used for the CODA paper, the Cooperation Data Bank paper, is called SciBird. And what people do when they train these models is they just feed them, in this case, a bunch of scientific papers, and the model learns to represent words that are used consistently in a similar way, in a similar place in space. But what that space is to some extent arbitrary. Now, if the model does its job well, then it should be interchangeable with another transformer model. So its influence should be minimal, right? Because it's just a numeric representation of how people use language. But of course, you could test that assumption again by performing a multiverse analysis. So how do you do it? You use a transformer model. A transformer model's only job is to take language and project it into numeric space. If it doesn't have a strong inductive bias, then it should be interchangeable with other large language models. But I like to use SciBird because it has been fed this diet of scientific papers. So I think it will understand the way that we use terms better than if it had been trained on Twitter and Reddit.
Okay, great. So, and then Nikita asks, thanks a lot. Regarding the encoder models, or I guess maybe the transformer models to cluster groups of words, can you elaborate a bit on the machine learning, factorization, and clustering methods you use? So I think you've answered a little bit, but
Yeah.
it asks, is the paper or repository for study two already published?
Yeah, so we had a transfer of first authorship for the second study, and the new first author preferred not to publish a preprint. So that's not out there yet. We used HDB scan for the clustering. So for people who are in this field, that's a clustering method that preserves local structure and it's non-parametric. So for example, a mixture model would draw perfect spheres or the multidimensional equivalent of that. And this one just identifies groups of terms regardless of the shape of that group. So HDB scan. And for dimension reduction, I think we first just used principal component analysis, and then we settled on something else. And the method we used for dimension reduction is UMAP. So whatever that says to people, it's basically a non-parametric principal component analysis. So you may need 700 plus dimensions to be able to distinguish all kinds of words, but when you're ultimately dealing with just 50 constructs in a specific field of literature, then 30 dimensions should be fine. And that's what we did. So we reduced those 750 dimensions to about 30 and then did our clustering. And that's honestly mostly for computational reasons.
Okay, great. So we do have another question. So, so you took Cybert and then fine-tuned it with your corpus of papers. So yeah, was that what you did?
Yes, exactly.
And how many papers did you use to fine-tune it? Was that like a separate like data set?
Yeah, so we didn't use papers to fine tune it. We used
Oh, that's
500
right. Yeah.
examples of causal sentences and 500 examples of non-causal sentences. So theoretically, Fine-tuning is an approach that leaves most of the model untouched, but updates some weights. And theoretically, a large language model should be able to be updated in that way with just a few hundred examples. We found that the performance gains were substantial. So I think we saw up to a 20% performance increase in identifying causal and non-causal sentences for some of the models that showed the most dramatic increases. So it seems that our empirical results are in line with the theoretical results on that.
Wonderful. That's great. That's a huge like gain, 20%.
And this preprint is out there. It's on SciArchive by Rasul Norouzi. And I think the reference is also in the slides, which I will share. So these are the slides that I used for today.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think this your presentation and your work on text mining and systematic reviews is just amazing. And it's amazing that somebody hasn't really delved into this like you before. But I mean, it's going to be a huge bonus for anybody doing any kind of evidence synthesis. So I really want to thank you for this presentation today.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a joy to talk about it. There's also other people who are working in this space. We're all approaching it in a slightly different way, so it's also nice to compare that. I think
That's
that
right.
Meta just published something with Stanford, which is also somewhat related to causality and text mining of scientific literature. But I believe they end up with an updated large language model that you can query. So that's a very different approach than what we're trying to do because we're trying to get the network out, right? We're ultimately trying to construct a DAG to combine this approach with causal inference.
Great. Tanya asks, were the initial dimensional reductions, for example, from 700 to 30, performed
Hmm.
manually or using other machine learning or pruning methods?
Yeah, so that's what I was looking up in my paper earlier, which dimension reduction technique we used, and we used UMAP. And if people are not familiar with the technique, you can think of this as a kind of non-parametric principal components analysis.
Is that UMAN?
UMAP, so with a
Oh,
P
map.
at the end. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, got it.
Unifold, uniform manifold, something, something, something. It's yeah, you can Google it, but it's
Okay,
an off-the-shelf solution.
okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for everybody out there for coming and enjoying Dr. Van Lissa's talk. So please join us for the next Method Speaker Series. And Dr. Van Lissa, we really look forward to seeing more of this research coming out soon.
Thanks for having me, and thanks all for being here.